Okay, so this video is 1.4a and it's on solving absolute value equations. So we know a little bit about absolute value. We can put the date right here, please. So you can put the date right here. You might have an S, which is for student, and I have a T for teacher because my version's a little different. You can put the date here, and it's 1.4a. So in your book, it corresponds to 1.4, and your note paper says 1.4a. And the video that we're making is also 1.4a. So all those names should match up. Now, an absolute value is that number's distance from 0, okay? So why don't you just underline or highlight distance from 0, okay? This is what you know absolute value to be, so just underline that for me if you could. Because distance can never be negative, the absolute value of a number can also never be negative. So if we had the absolute value of something coming out as 7, what two things have a distance from 0 of 7? We got to think about that. So I'm thinking about two things that have a distance from 0 of 7. I'm thinking that 7 is 7 units from 0, right? And negative 7 is 7 units from 0. Does that make sense? So both of those things have a distance of 7 from 0. Make sense to you? The other thing we want to talk about is x. The absolute value of x is equal to 5. So what two things are 5 distances from 0? Or what two things could we take the absolute value of and get 5? Well, if we took the absolute value of 5, the absolute value of 5 is equal to 5. That's true. And if we took the absolute value of negative 5, we would also get 5, right? Also get 5. So that should make some pretty good sense to you. So you can circle these and get the idea. Now, what I wanted to stress here is that when we have these absolute value symbols, which are two lines, right, to show that the thing is always going to come out positive, right? It makes whatever's inside of it positive. We have those two lines. I like to think 2 lines, 2 answers. There are typically 99% of the time going to be 2 answers to these things. We see numbers 1 and 2 as pretty simple, but it's going to get a little trickier from there. It's going to get a little trickier pretty quick because what we got to focus on is this okay, this problem right here where we have negative 9, absolute value of b equals negative 72. So I want to isolate the absolute value. And we're going to go into steps with that in a second. But if you want to think about it this way as isolate the absolute value, and if you think about isolating, that's like when you, you lock yourself in your room and you don't want to talk to anybody. You isolate yourself, right? So isolating the absolute value means the absolute value must be alone. Nothing can be in front of it. So this thing in front of it is squished up against it. I want you to think of that as multiplication. Anytime it's squished up against it, it's multiplication. So we're going to cancel out multiplication with division, right? We should be comfortable with that. So when we cancel out with division, we have the following. This is gone. And we have the absolute value of b is equal to 8, I think. So once we have the absolute value of b is equal to 8, we can solve that just like we did up above. You guys notice what we did up above? So what two numbers could take the absolute value and get 8? What two numbers could we take the absolute value of and get 8? Well, if we take the absolute value of 8, we get 8. And if we take the absolute value of negative 8, we get 8, right? So some of these we can kind of do in our head. We can kind of think about what's going on here. So 8 and negative 8 are our answers. Seems very simple, but I'm just building up to something that's a little harder. So we look at this next problem, we start to think to ourselves, k, the absolute value of k minus 5 is equal to 3. So if that's the case, is the absolute value alone? Yes or no? Is the absolute value alone? I don't want anything outside of there on that side of the equation. So where this equation is, I don't want anything there. Does that make sense? So I'm going to go ahead and add 5 to both sides. So with this problem, what we want to do is we want to first isolate the absolute value. So whatever's not with the absolute value is not good. Like whatever's not inside has to go. So this is what we want alone. So that means that negative 5 is not okay. Absolute value must be alone, okay? Say that to yourself. The absolute value must be alone. It's important because otherwise we can't use the tricks, the knowledge that we have of absolute value to make two equations. Now we know the answers have to be 8 and negative 8. We can kind of just think about that in our head. It makes sense. The absolute value is 8. Absolute value of k is equal to 8. Then the answers must be 8 and negative 8. So we're in pretty good shape there. The next thing we want to do is, so what we want to do now is talk about steps to a little bit tougher types of problems. So the first thing we want to do is fill this in. When we're solving an absolute value equation, step 1 is to rearrange the equation so the absolute value brackets are alone. Alone. Fill in alone, please. You need to have the absolute value brackets alone. What does that mean? There's no number in front outside of the absolute value. There's no number after the absolute value. And there's no number underneath it on that side of the equation. But there can be tons of stuff inside there. That's fine, as long as it's contained inside the absolute values on that one side. Then you want to realize, what if the absolute value came out to a negative number? So what if we had the absolute value of x is equal to -9? What are the answers to that? Do you think the answers are 9 and -9? You might think that at first, but if you look at that for a second, okay, and you say, okay, well, maybe the answer is 9 and -9. The absolute value of 9, is that -9? Is that true? No, it's not. The absolute value of 9 is not -9. So 9 is not the answer. 9 is definitely not the answer. 9 is out, okay? You might think it's -9, right? But is the absolute value of -9 also -9? No, it's not. So actually -9's out. And if those are the answers you thought that they were and they're out, what do you think the answer is to this thing? What could be taking the absolute value and come out as a negative? Nothing, right? No solution. No solution is correct. Thank you for that. So let's keep in mind that there is no solution. And I know you probably were able to kind of check this out, right? If the whole absolute value is equal to a negative, then there is no solution. Please write that, okay? But this is after you've done the rearranging. So we're going to do some problems, mostly in just a few seconds. The next thing you want to do is write 2 equations without the absolute value. Write 2 equations without the absolute value. Please fill that in, okay? Please fill in 2 equations without the absolute value. One with a positive and one with a negative value. So for right now, I'm thinking it might be a good idea to quickly do this out with this problem here. So I'm going to take this problem and I'm going to move it up here. And we'll see if we can try to do this problem. Whoops, sorry about that. So what we want to do now is, I want to work through this example while we're going through it. So I want to take this for a second, and I want to go through the few steps here. So the first question is the equation rearranged? Yes. And is the equation equal to a negative? No. So there is a solution to this thing, right? There is a solution. This thing's going to work out fine. So now we got to go to step 2, which says the following. Step 2 says write 2 equations, one with a positive value and one with a negative value. So 1 equals 11 and 1 equals -11. And we don't have the absolute value anymore. That's an important thing to remember. We don't have absolute value anymore when we do this equation. So now we have 2 equations that should work. Why is that? Why do those 2 equations work? Well, this thing right here helps me to understand. Whatever's underneath this hand right here, if that hand is 11, what is the absolute value of 11? If that hand is 11, what is the absolute value of 11? Anybody have any ideas about that? Thoughts? Yes? The absolute value of 11 is going to be 11, right? And what if this whole thing, what if this is -11? Well, the absolute value of -11 is going to be 11 as well. Agree? So that kind of makes some good sense, actually. It really makes a lot of sense to me. So what I do is I take the hand away and I write down what was underneath the hand, which happened to have been, right? If we look at what was under the hand, it was in fact this and that each time. So that's what this is, the hand, right? That's this and this was underneath here. So we're just writing those 2 things to equal a positive and a negative. Now we're going to solve each of them. Look at both of those equations and think to yourself, can I solve each of those equations? So I'm just going to quickly solve this, assuming that you're okay with it. 4x equals 12, x equals 3. And if you're having trouble solving these equations, please go back to basically sections 1.1 and 1.2. And if you look in 1.1 and 1.2, I have some videos on how to solve these kinds of things. So now we have x equals negative, I think it's going to be 2.5 here. So these are our 2 answers, and we could check them by plugging them back in. That's basically what's going on here. So if we plug in, let's say 3, for example, back into the 4x, right? Well, if we do that, we're going to get 12 minus 1. And if we have 12 minus 1, that's 11. The absolute value of 11 is 11. If we plug in this number, negative 2.5, well, negative 2.5 times 4 is negative 6, right? Oh, sorry, negative 10, right? Negative 10. Negative 10 minus 1 is going to be negative 11. Absolute value of negative 11 is 11. So that's kind of what's going on there. So that's pretty much the end of that example, and hopefully that made some sense. Now we're going to try some more. All right, so now we're going to go to the next page. So we can turn to this page here, and we're going to get through as many of these examples as we can. We might not get through all of them, but let's see what we can do, okay? So the first equation that we want to ask ourselves is the absolute value alone. Is the absolute value alone? And how do we know that? Well, what we do is we look on this side of the line, and we say, is there anything outside of the absolute value? Is there anything in front of it? Is there anything after it? Is there anything above it? Is there anything underneath it? No. Everything is contained inside those two walls there. And so the absolute value is alone, and we can split this equation. So now we can split it into two equations. So we're going to have one equation over here, right? And then I guess we'll have another equation. We'll have another equation on the other side over here. The first equation, I'm dropping the absolute value now because I know whatever that stuff is, stuff must be 6 or stuff must be negative 6. When I say stuff, I'm referring to this right here. Stuff must be 6 or stuff must be negative 6. So I'm writing stuff equals 6, and then that stuff equals negative 6. I don't know which it is, so I could put an or here. Either of those is the right answer. When I do the workout here, I add the 4. I get x equals 10. And when I do the workout here, I add the 4. I get x equals negative 2. So these are my two answers. And how do I know if they're right? Well, I can just take negative 2 and the negative 4 and put that in the absolute value symbol and see if that's true. Well, that tells me that the absolute value of negative 6 is 6. That's true, so this is the right answer. That's how you check a solution. Let's look at the second equation and see if you can think about how to do this one. What are our thoughts on the second one? What are our thoughts on the second one? Anybody have any ideas on that? Is there a solution? Think about that, yes. So the answer was there's no solution because it's negative. That's true, because the absolute value is alone right now, and it comes out as a negative. What could I possibly put here? What could I possibly put that's going to come out as negative 5 when you absolute value it? What could you possibly put? Anything? Yeah, you could, but there's no number that will work, right? There's no number that will work for that. So that's what we got. There is no number that will come out as a negative, so I can't put 5 in here. That's not true. That's absolutely not true, because the absolute value of 5 is 5. And I can't put negative 5 in here, because the absolute value of negative 5 is 5. So neither of these are the right answer. There's no solution to this. Because of that, because of the absolute value coming out as a negative, you can't absolute value anything, and it comes out as negative 5. The next question here is the 2n plus 8n is equal to 0. I think what we want to do with that is we want to split it because the absolute value is alone right now. This isn't quite a negative number, but it's not quite a positive number, is it? So if you were to write two equations, I mean, I guess you could write 2 plus 8n equals 0 and 2 plus 8n equals negative 0, but is negative 0 even a thing? It's not, right? So because negative 0 is not a thing, you're still going to have 0 here. So you're kind of, I said 99% of the time there's two answers, but in this case, you don't have to work on that anymore, because they're going to be the same answer when it's equal to 0. Because what's the distance that 0 is from 0? It's 0, right? So this one's just going to come out to, I think it's going to be 8n equals negative 2, and n equals negative 1/4. So now what I want you to do is pause the video and try these equations down below, these ones right here. And it says NYT. If you don't know what NYT means, because you're towards the beginning of the course now, NYT stands for now you try. So I like to have you guys try the problems. So NYT stands for now you try. So pause the video and give these 3 problems a shot. Okay, so it looks like these now you tries, they came out pretty good. I'm going to say the answers. So if you've done the problems and you pause the video, get ready. The answer to 1 is 10 and negative 10. 10 and negative 10, both answers. are the answer. The answer to 2 was 5 and -3. 5 and -3, 2 answers, 2 lines, 2 answers. And 3 was no solution because you can't have it come out to a negative. So finally, we're going to just do a couple more examples. This is really all I've got for you, just a couple more examples. So I want to try this problem. There's something outside the absolute value. I cannot split this right now. I cannot split it until I add the 10 to both sides, and I've isolated the absolute value. So now I have 3x plus 9. In the absolute value is 6. So step 2 says to split into 2 equations. This is not no solution because the absolute value is coming out to a positive 6. So whatever that stuff is that the hand has been covering up, or the heart, or whatever, the heart must equal 6, or the heart must equal -6. So what we're going to do is I'm going to write what's underneath the heart equal to 6 and equal to -6. I don't know which answer is correct because there's actually 2 answers to this problem. 2 answers to one equation because it has absolute value. So this stuff, I'm going to color code it for you. This stuff must have been 6. This stuff must have been 6, or that stuff must have been -6. And if that's the case, these are the 2 equations we need to solve. Yes, you solved the equations, but I'm going to skip that in the interest of time. So if you solve these 2 equations, I think you'll come out with a couple answers of like -1 and -5, okay? I think you'll come out with answers of -1 and -5. Now, when we look at 4, 5, and 6, I want to give you a tip of the day on 5, because these are for you to try, but this 4, again, is multiplied. So make sure you're dividing both sides by 4 as your first step when you're trying these. So that's it. I want to wrap up the video there. Isolate the absolute value so it's completely alone, like so, under the green line, then split into 2 and solve each. So there are 3 now you tries. You try those problems, pause the video, give them a shot, and I will see you in the next video. Peace.